Hola, muy buenos días. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a nuestra cátedra Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero. El día de hoy iniciamos este evento en galardonados en el marco del 50 aniversario de nuestra facultad y del 100 aniversario de nuestra universidad con un programa muy especial. Antes de entrar de lleno al programa, quisiera dar la bienvenida a quienes hoy nos acompañan, la doctora Mirta Margarita Flores Galás, que nos va a compartir unas palabras. Doctora, adelante, bienvenida.
Sí, buenos días, de nueva cuenta. Bienvenidos todos y todas a esta Cátedra Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero 2022, que justamente se enmarca en el 50 aniversario de la facultad, de la fundación de nuestra facultad y de nuestra universidad, y que justamente tiene un papel muy importante y el comenzar a hablar sobre, en este caso, las relaciones interculturales, abordaje desde la psicología social, que es el tema de esta cátedra de este año. En este caso, es muy importante señalar que el doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero jugó un papel muy importante en la facultad, puesto que fue cofundador. Y justamente desde hace 10 años, el Cuerpo Académico de Psicología Social ha venido realizando una cátedra anualmente en la que nosotros continuamos con ese legado que ha dejado el doctor Díaz-Guerrero, y que diferentes colegas o diferentes estudiantes que a través de los años han seguido realizando investigación, bueno, pues permiten seguir y continuar todo este trabajo realizado acerca de la psicología del mexicano. En este año, nuestra cátedra se divide en 2 sesiones. En la primera sesión, que es una sesión híbrida, diríamos de esta manera, puesto que el día de hoy comienza nuestra primera conferencia y el día de mañana, que van a ser sesiones virtuales, y el viernes va a ser una sesión presencial. La cátedra en esta ocasión cuenta con ponentes de muy alto nivel. En este caso, los 5 ponentes que van a participar en la cátedra son ponentes de reconocido prestigio a nivel internacional y a nivel nacional. El primer ponente que vamos a escuchar el día de hoy, el doctor John Berry, es profesor de la Universidad de Queens en Canadá. Pero el doctor John Berry ha jugado un papel muy importante en la psicología transcultural. Es imposible leer un libro de psicología transcultural sin hablar y estudiar toda su teoría de la aculturación. Entonces, es un autor que debemos siempre, o que casi todos los psicólogos en las investigaciones que se dedican en esta área van a citar porque ha jugado un papel muy importante. Entonces, pues estamos muy, muy contentos de que el doctor John Berry haya querido colaborar con nosotros y darnos a conocer los temas que está presentando actualmente y sobre todo continuar ampliando toda su teoría. El día de mañana vamos a tener la conferencia del doctor Héctor Betancourt, que él viene de la Universidad de Loma Linda. El doctor Héctor Betancourt es un psicólogo de origen chileno, pero que toda su formación y todo su trabajo académico lo ha realizado en Estados Unidos. Entonces, el doctor Héctor Betancourt se ha enfocado en diversos temas, aspectos sobre política, pero también un área que ha desarrollado mucho es el aspecto de salud. Y justamente ha realizado estudios, tanto de investigación básica como de investigación aplicada, sobre la salud, las relaciones interculturales en población latina. Es decir, qué papel está jugando el hecho de la cultura de la que están llegando los migrantes para que se atiendan a diferentes problemas de salud. Entonces tiene un área, un departamento ahí en la Universidad de Loma Linda muy grande que se desarrolla investigación sobre psicología y salud. Entonces, el día de mañana nos va a venir a platicar justamente todas estas relaciones interculturales y salud y el rol de estos factores psicosociales que inciden en ello. Posteriormente, el viernes 28 de octubre, vamos a tener la conferencia Una mirada etnopsicológica al autoconcepto, que en este caso va a ser impartida por el doctor Rolando Díaz-Lobin, de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. El doctor Rolando Díaz-Lobin, pues también jugó un papel muy importante apoyando a la facultad en un periodo desde hace algunos años, puesto que el vínculo que ha tenido con la facultad es justamente muy sentimental. Él es hijo del doctor Díaz-Guerrero y siempre ha platicado que desde muy joven venía junto con su papá a, a ver nuestra facultad y posteriormente pues ya ha participado y ha siempre apoyado en diversos programas de posgrado en nuestra facultad a lo largo de todo su desarrollo. Entonces, este día 28 de octubre vamos a tener una sesión presencial con el doctor en el que nos presenta esta continuación de los trabajos del doctor Díaz-Guerrero para tratar de explicar al mexicano, que en este caso nos va a hablar de cómo somos los mexicanos, cuál es ese autoconcepto que podemos tener los mexicanos de nosotros mismos. Entonces, con estas primeras tres conferencias, es la primera sesión de nuestra cátedra y la segunda sesión de la cátedra en este caso va a ser los días 9 de noviembre y 10 de noviembre, que va a ser presencial. El 9 de noviembre vamos a tener también la presencia del doctor Ipe Portinga de la Universidad de Tilburg, de Países Bajos, en Holanda particularmente, y el doctor Ipe Portinga también es un ícono de la psicología transcultural. Cualquier artículo, libro que revisemos también de psicología transcultural, vamos a tener las contribuciones del doctor Ipe Portinga. Entonces, pues nosotros estamos sumamente contentos de que él amablemente se haya ofrecido a venir, porque él quería tener el contacto con nosotros, con los estudiantes, para que pudiera transmitir todo lo que ha trabajado. Y ahí vemos cómo este tipo de personajes, eso es lo que los caracteriza, ¿no? Esa sencillez para transmitir los conocimientos. Entonces, pues esta conferencia se va a llevar a cabo el miércoles 9 de 10 a 11 y posteriormente vamos a tener un conversatorio con el doctor para todos aquellos interesados que de manera más cercana quieran platicar con él, hacerle preguntas, exponerle sus dudas acerca de sus contribuciones, etcétera. Entonces, creo que es muy importante esta participación que vamos a tener. Y finalmente, el jueves 10 de noviembre, vamos a tener la conferencia de nuevos retos en psicometría a cargo de la doctora Alejandra Domínguez Espinosa de la Universidad Iberoamericana. La doctora Alejandra es una psicóloga que ha tenido y se ha formado en toda la medición psicométrica, trabajó muy de cerca con la doctora Reyes y particularmente también ha trabajado con un personaje de la psicología transcultural que hace, me parece ser casi 2 años falleció, Fons van Bieber, experto en medición psicométrica. Entonces, pues nos viene a presentar a qué se enfrenta la psicometría. Es una persona que en México se ha dedicado muchísimo a esta área y que creo que los conocimientos que nos puede proporcionar siempre son muy enriquecedores. Quisiera también particularmente agradecer a Alejandra, puesto que ella ha trabajado muy de cerca tanto con John Berry y con Ipe Portinga y fue una pues gestión y convencimiento de ellos para que al comunicarnos pudieran participar con nosotros en esta cátedra. Entonces, pues creo que esta cátedra es muy rica. Tenemos personajes muy, muy importantes y que vale la pena que participemos maestros y estudiantes para poder tener esta ampliación de los conocimientos sobre esta área. Finalmente, yo quisiera agradecer en primer lugar al cuerpo académico, a la doctora Lourdes Cortés, a la doctora María Teresa Morales y a la doctora María José Campos, que pues de manera colegiada hemos estado trabajando para desarrollar todo este trabajo, así como también el trabajo cotidiano que realizamos en el cuerpo académico. Quisiera también agradecer a la doctora Daisy Pasos y a Lázaro Celis, que nos han apoyado en todos estos aspectos técnicos. Obviamente también a todo el equipo de tecnología de nuestra universidad y particularmente pues al maestro Jesús Esteban Sosa Chan, director de nuestra facultad, que siempre pues nos ha apoyado en todos los emprendimientos que tenemos a nivel científico para trabajar en el cuerpo académico. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias y pues esperamos que sea muy enriquecedora esta cátedra que comenzamos el día de hoy. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctora Mirta Flores, como siempre dando mucho contexto, sobre todo en la parte de la historia, ¿no? De la psicología, permitiéndonos tocar de cerca justamente también esos elementos, no solo científicos, sino de la historia y dónde se va enmarcando este evento, que además me consta que se ha cuidado por estos años, ¿no? Y se ha procurado. A continuación, quisiera darle la palabra al director de nuestra facultad, el maestro Jesús Esteban Sosa Chan. Bienvenido, muy buenos días.
Muy buenos días. Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Es un gusto que nos estén acompañando para esta cátedra que, como muy bien dicho la doctora Mirta Flores, pues es una cátedra a nivel internacional, ¿no? La calidad de los ponentes que tenemos son de primera y eso se debe al trabajo conjunto de cada uno de los miembros del cuerpo académico de psicología social que bien ha ido trabajando año con año. Ya tienen 10 años en esto, así que ya tienen una amplia experiencia con las cátedras. Es un placer para nosotros como Facultad de Psicología recibirlos en este acto de inauguración de la cátedra del doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero. Ya la doctora Mirta Flores explicó en algún momento la participación y la injerencia que tuvo el doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero en el desarrollo de nuestra facultad. Nuestra facultad en gran parte se debe al ímpetu que él junto con don Víctor Castillo Vales impulsaron a que la facultad primero se convierta como escuela de psicología en el año de 1972 y luego en todos los años siguientes fue profesor visitante, acompañante. Mirta no se puede quejar, fue hija académica del doctor, o sea, estuvo muy cercana al doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero. Y nosotros también, porque mucho tiempo vino con nosotros y cada año venía, como dice Mirta, con Rolando, su hijo, venía y tanto era el aprecio y cariño que le tenía a la facultad, porque algo que hay que recalcar del doctor Rogelio no solo es su calidad como profesional, sino también su calidad humana. Muchas veces nos olvidamos de esto, pero la calidad humana del doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero, la verdad, nos los demostraba día con día cada vez que estaba con nosotros y cuando no estaba, porque siempre estaba en la disposición de querer colaborar con nosotros, sea en investigación, sea en clases, en lo que nosotros necesitásemos, él estaba siempre allá para apoyarnos. Y luego, pues, como buen modelo que fue, pues su hijo continuó con este quehacer, ¿no? Y que también ha estado colaborando con nosotros. Entonces, debido a eso, y creo que lo menos que podíamos hacer para él era darle un nombre a la cátedra, y por eso la cátedra se llama Doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero. Anteriormente, en nuestro edificio anterior de la facultad, pues la biblioteca llevaba su nombre, pero ahora como ya estamos en campus, pues el área que recibe el nombre del doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero es el área de psicología aplicada, donde se encuentran los laboratorios y se realiza la investigación, porque él fue un gran investigador y muy bien todos ustedes lo conocen. Entonces, nosotros cada año con año nos hemos tratado de resaltar los diferentes ámbitos de interés de la psicología contemporánea y específicamente ahorita hablando de las relaciones interculturales de la etnopsicología, pues más que nada, ¿no? Este año para nosotros es muy importante porque cumplimos 50 años. Decirlo es muy fácil, pero toda la historia que ha tenido la facultad pues ha sido muy grande, y para no irnos con mucho preámbulo, pues lo pueden ustedes leer en el libro que presentamos hace algunos días de Apuntes e Imágenes para una Historia, 50 años de la Facultad de Psicología, ¿no? Y también en el marco del centenario de la fundación de la universidad. Nuestra facultad, junto con este espíritu que don Víctor y que don Rogelio inyectaron en todos los estudiantes, pues siempre estuvo inmerso con un símbolo que es la calidad. La calidad del trabajo de don Rogelio, de don Víctor, pues es un símbolo y es una señal que tenemos nosotros como facultad. Nosotros somos una facultad de calidad, no por los reconocimientos externos que hemos recibido, sino por la calidad de sus profesores, por la formación, por la filosofía que tenemos en sí, nos habla de que somos una facultad de calidad. Los reconocimientos son por añadidura, son en recompensa a todo lo que nosotros somos y con el quehacer que hacemos diario y que es fortalecido todos los días por el trabajo de los cuerpos académicos y profesores. Entonces, por eso, el doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero ha dejado un legado importante en nosotros, al conocimiento que nuestra historia, raíces y tradiciones tienen sobre nuestra personalidad individual y colectiva, y por lo tanto ha estado motivando al entendimiento del mexicano y las premisas socioculturales. Es el primero que estudió la psicología del mexicano y que hemos nosotros y que lo tenemos como materia porque es sumamente importante el conocimiento de él. Sus investigaciones formaron un cuerpo de conocimientos que nos han coadyuvado no solo a esto, sino también al conocimiento científico de la psicología de las Américas. Se ha extendido su trabajo, caracterizándose por la orientación culturalista de pensamiento, su adhesión a lo transcultural y el desarrollo de la psicología nativa, y alentando con ello que se resaltara el poder de nuestra historia, nuestras raíces, nuestras tradiciones que tienen sobre nuestra personalidad individual y colectiva, y motivando así a que psicólogos latinoamericanos, y ahora no solo latinoamericanos, sino de todo el mundo, dibujaran esta expresión sociocultural en la identidad de la psicología de cada país. Estas son algunas de las aportaciones que dejó el doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero en nosotros, en los mexicanos y en el mundo. Entonces, no hay mejor mérito que podamos hacer nosotros dándole nombre a esta cátedra, doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero. Y más en el marco de nuestro 50 aniversario con las personalidades que nos acompañan. Y si nos damos cuenta, hablando de interculturalidad, tenemos gente de Canadá, de Estados Unidos, de los Países Bajos, de México. Entonces, pues siendo las 10 horas en punto, como psicólogos que somos puntuales, siendo las 10 horas, damos por inauguradas las actividades de esta cátedra, doctor Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero, que se llama, y que la llamamos también, Relaciones Interculturales, un abordaje desde la psicología social. Éxito, que es lo mejor que podamos tener, y que aprovechemos la oportunidad que nos dan los ponentes para poderlos escuchar y aprender de ellos. El éxito y felicidades.
Muchísimas gracias al maestro Jesús Esteban Sosa por hacer el acto inaugural de nuestra tan querida cátedra. Ahora sí, muchísimas gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañan. Esperamos disfruten cada uno de estos eventos. Como comentó la doctora Mirta, están organizados de cierta manera para poder combinarlo con las diferentes actividades que sabemos que tenemos en el día a día, pero procurando privilegiar la oportunidad de escuchar a este programa, a estos ponentes tan importantes que además de manera muy compartida vienen y nos van a compartir las visiones de la trayectoria que tienen y las aportaciones que se han hecho y todavía los retos, ¿no?, que nos esperan. Pues muchas gracias. Primera conferencia y muchas gracias, doctora Mirta, muchas gracias, maestro Jesús. Y bueno, hoy tengo la oportunidad y personalmente para mí es muy especial poder presentar a nuestro primer conferencista, como ya comentó la doctora Mirta, que es el doctor John Berry. Él nos acompaña el día de hoy. Cuando le mandamos el correo para invitarlo a estar con nosotros, él nos contestó enseguida, diciendo que con mucho gusto, lo cual de verdad nos llena de alegría. Y me permito presentarle. Good morning, Dr. John.
Good morning, everyone.
Le voy a presentar como es debido. El doctor John Berry es profesor emérito de Psicología de la Universidad de Queen en Canadá. Se graduó de la licenciatura de la Universidad Sir George Williams en 1963 y recibe el título de doctorado de la Universidad de Edimburgo. Recibió la distinción de doctorado honoris causa de las universidades de Atenas y la Universidad de Ginebra en 2001. Es miembro de numerosas sociedades académicas como la International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology, la International Association for Analytical Psychology. También es miembro de CPR, entre otras, y es miembro de la Royal Society of Canada. Ha publicado más de 40 libros y más de 300 artículos y capítulos en las áreas de psicología transcultural, intercultural, social y cognitiva con diversos colegas, también de mucho renombre. Además, posee o publicó el libro de texto Cross-Cultural Psychology, Research and Applications de la Cambridge University. Sus libros más recientes están entre ellos el Cambridge Handbook of Acculturation Psychology en el 2016. También tiene el Cross-Cultural Psychology en el 2016 también. Otro de sus libros es titulado Ecology, Culture and Human Development, Lessons for Adivasi Education. Y en el 2017 publica el Mutual Intercultural Relations. Y tiene dos más recientemente, en el 2018, el Value and Identity, Change in Post-Community Societies. Y el último, en el 2019, el titulado Acculturation, A Personal Journey Across Cultures. Como podemos dar cuenta de toda la trayectoria del doctor John Berry, hay mucho que podemos aprenderle. Como comentaba la doctora Mirta, es inevitable, ¿no?, trabajar sobre estos temas sin citarlo, sin mencionarlo. Y bueno, sin más preámbulo, le doy la bienvenida a nombre de nuestra facultad y en nombre de la Psicología Social en Yucatán. Y you are very welcoming, Dr. Berry, and we are so glad to have you and happy and excited to hear you. Él nos va a compartir su conferencia que tengo la oportunidad de compartir a continuación y que se titula Living Together in Cultural Diverse Societies. Go ahead, Dr. Berry. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation and that very generous introduction. I'm always happy to engage with my colleagues from Mexico, one of my favorite places in the world. And I appreciate being invited to contribute to this Cátedra for my good friend, Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero. The title, as you can see there, is Living Together in Culturally Diverse Societies. I need to have some guidance on how to go to the next slide. Do I click down here? Yes, that's good. So I, of course, dedicate this presentation to the memory of my good friend and colleague. and I have always appreciated his insights into the indigenous features of Mexico and the psychology that has been developed there. This has inspired me to continue similar work in Canada. I would also like to thank colleagues from many parts of the world over the years who have contributed to the development of the ideas and research projects, both in Canada and internationally. I first heard Rogelio speak at the 1966 International Congress of Psychology in Tokyo. There was a rather ethnocentric paper presented by a US American in a symposium, and he was obviously annoyed, and he called out, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States," which drew some laughter, but also some very unpleasant comments from the audience. Because we in Canada share the same situation, both geopolitically and in the field of psychology, I introduced myself to him after the symposium, and we discussed our common views about our situation in relation to our big neighbor. We became close friends after that and have continued until his passing. So our common geopolitical situation in North America has been rendered by an artist, Greg Curnow, by a spoof map of North America. This map has captured our shared desire to reduce, possibly even eliminate, the influence of the USA on the concepts we use and the methods and our empirical research. We are daily bombarded by everything that is US American, and it's often led us to see ourselves in their terms rather than in our own terms, even, as Rogelio once argued, to the abnegation of our own cultures. So this has led many of us to create our own indigenous psychologies, where we examine our behaviors in our own cultural contexts. This map, which some of you may have seen before, shows that Canada and Mexico share a common border. This sleight of hand by Greg Curnow in the map has essentially eliminated the US and its influence from our personal lives, our political lives, and the psychology that we do. So I hope you enjoy the joke. To address the theme of this conference, I'll briefly outline some historical antecedents to and some concepts that have guided our research on how to live together in culturally diverse societies. Then I will try to show you that there are some principles of relationships that may be universal in the sense that they operate similarly in many societies. Each of these principles is rooted in the Canadian policy of multiculturalism, which represents my Indigenous approach, which seeks to promote more positive relationships amongst all ethnocultural communities living in Canada. The search for an answer to the question of how to live together will examine each of these three principles and employ examples of research, both internationally and in Canada. I will then draw some conclusions and consider some implications for intercultural policy and practice. So historically, Canada has been culturally diverse since the very beginning of human settlement. This includes, of course, Indigenous peoples who occupied many different parts of the territory with different languages, different cultures, and different economic systems. So the diversity of the Canadian population is nothing new, but it was radically increased through the colonization and settlement from many parts of the world. For centuries, Canadian policy dealing with the question of how to manage relationships amongst all these peoples has been one that advocated the assimilation of cultural communities and their members into one mainly European-based society. You, of course, experience the same issue in Mexico. At the same time, we engaged in a form of segregation for indigenous peoples and their exclusion, as well as the exclusion of others who were deemed to be unassimilable. The goal seemed to have been to create one people from many disparate ethnocultural communities, or alternatively, to simply cast the others to one side. However, John Buchan, who was quite a famous British author, and he was also the Governor General of Canada, he argued in 1937 against this assimilation policy. He argued that we should retain, various immigrant groups should retain their individuality, distinctiveness, and make their contribution to the national society, and each could learn from the other. That is, we should encourage the continuation of cultural uniqueness, cultural differences, and engage in social interactions amongst all the various communities, rather than being separate. A few years later, an international conference on the integration of post-war migrants was held in Cuba by UNESCO. The official Canadian position paper on what was considered the appropriate approach to immigrant settlement stated that Canadian society should be built on the ideas of individual worth and cultural differences. The pressure of one dominant group to assimilate, that is, to absorb others, is therefore impractical as a general theory. This is from the official paper. So following in these steps, in 1971, the Canadian federal government announced a policy which they called a multicultural policy. The main statements of the policy were, first of all, the goal was the assurance of cultural freedom of all Canadians. Such a policy should help break down discrimination and negative attitudes towards different cultural groups. And then it went on to say that national unity, which of course has been a big issue for most culturally diverse societies, if it's to mean anything in the deeply personal sense, it must be founded on confidence in one's own individual identity. And this I'll pick up on later. And out of this can grow respect for that of others and a willingness to share ideas, attitudes, and assumptions. In order to achieve the goal of better intergroup relations, the government will support and encourage the various cultural and ethnic groups that give structure and vitality to society. They will be encouraged to share their cultural expression and values with other Canadians and to contribute to a richer life for all. Now, following in this statement, we see a continuing emphasis on two of the core principles of multiculturalism. One, the value of maintaining heritage cultures across generations in order to provide a secure cultural place for everyone. And secondly, the importance of social engagement and sharing amongst cultural communities in order that we can come to know each other better. Note that both principles are essential. The first one deals with diversity. The second one deals with social sharing. So the policy is an intercultural one. It's not just a diversity policy, which has come to the fore in some parts of social psychology. So the policy, which we have just seen an excerpt from, promoted the goal of mutual acceptance through the reduction of prejudice and discrimination. And it was to be achieved by these two principles: the promotion of cultural maintenance by those who wish to do so. There was not going to be any requirement that you keep your cultural identity. And secondly, encouraging social contact amongst all groups who wish to do so by participating in the larger society. So in 1984, I produced a framework that was requested by the then Department of Multiculturalism in the federal government. The question that I was asked was, do these various components of the policy hang together? Do they make sense in any integrated way as a policy from the point of view of psychology? So what I did was to identify, first of all, in the upper right-hand corner, the goal of the policy, the mutual acceptance amongst all ethnocultural groups, reduction of hostilities, and so on. The two major programs to achieve this goal were in the upper left-hand corner, what we call the cultural component. That is, the ethnocultural groups should be encouraged to maintain and develop their cultural traditions within the framework of the larger Canadian society. That's the diversity component. The other major component, a social component, is that these cultural groups should not remain in isolation, but should engage in intergroup contact and participation in the larger society. The third program, which is particular to Canada, because we have officially a bilingual national state, is that there should be encouragement for everyone, whether they are French or mother tongue or English mother tongue or of other mother tongues, which we call allophones. They should be encouraged to learn both of the two official languages. Now, this framework gives rise to three hypotheses. The first is in the upper line, connecting the goal on the right to the promotion of cultural maintenance. You'll remember that the policy said that everyone should have a secure place in the national society. They should be confident in their own identity and ability to live cultural lives that they find to be desirable. So the multiculturalism hypothesis says that when people have confidence in and a secure place culturally in the society, then they will have the psychological basis to accept all of those who are culturally different. So confidence or security rooted in your cultural community should lead to the acceptance of others. The second hypothesis is the contact hypothesis, which is probably well known to most of you in social psychology, and that is the promotion of intergroup contact and participation should lead to greater mutual acceptance and the reduction of prejudice, which is the goal in the upper right-hand corner. So this is the second hypothesis, the contact hypothesis. The third hypothesis, which we call the integration hypothesis, links the cultural maintenance to social interaction. And that is when people are doubly involved or multiply involved in their own cultural group and in groups of other kinds of communities in the larger society, then you will have greater success, both personally and socioculturally, including acceptance of others in your daily life in the larger society. So the integration hypothesis is the third hypothesis. There's a fourth hypothesis, which I won't go into, and that is that when you are able to communicate with other people, it allows you to engage socially, and through that to increase mutual acceptance. So the hypotheses that I've just described to you are just outlined in these next slides. I won't read them, but you can see the multicultural hypothesis, the contact hypothesis, and the integration hypothesis. And just to reinforce it, the multiculturalism hypothesis is that a sense of confidence or security in one's cultural identity will be a psychological precondition for the acceptance of those who are culturally different. Conversely, when one's identity or culture is threatened through discrimination or exclusion, then people will have negative attitudes and reject others. The contact hypothesis is that social contact and sharing will promote mutual acceptance under certain conditions, especially when the contact is voluntary and when it is of relatively equal status. And the integration hypothesis is that individuals who maintain their heritage cultures and identities and who also engage with the larger society are likely to be more successful in their intercultural living than those who pursue only one or other of these identities. Excuse me. So these are the three hypotheses. They are psychological hypotheses. They are derived from statements in the policy. Are they valid? So psychological research that examines these questions of how to live together have been developed using theories and methods from social and cross-cultural psychology. This research can be carried out in a single society in order to better understand the local situation, but it can also be done internationally in an attempt to discover and assess some general principles that may be useful globally. These findings can then be directed to those who are developing policies and programs in a society that seek to improve the lives of all who try to live together. My own research and advocacy work over the past 50 years has maintained a focus on this question, both in Canada and in many other societies. So the main concepts employed in this research, the main domains are acculturation first, and second, intercultural relations. We can define acculturation as a process of cultural and psychological change that results from contact between different cultural groups and their individual members. These cultural changes in groups and psychological changes in individuals present both challenges and opportunities for psychological well-being. Over time, cultural and psychological adaptations emerge that may lead to either positive or negative intercultural relations. And these adaptations are often linked to the particular experiences of individuals, making it possible to identify which experiences will promote or undermine personal well-being and positive relations. So to try to understand the various ways in which acculturation and intercultural relations can take place, I have developed quite early on, from the 1970s, a framework that has become known as a acculturation strategies framework. So these are based on a general framework to understand the process of intercultural relations and acculturation. And in this framework, there are cultural group variables on the left and individual psychological variables on the right. So in this framework, on the left, you have cultural variables on the left and psychological variables on the right. And this is a kind of minimal situation, which is hardly ever met when you have only two groups, say A and B, in contact within the society. And these lead to cultural changes in both of the societies. What are their political organizations? What are their economic activities? What languages are predominantly used, and so on. So at the cultural level, we can understand the broad group level context within which intercultural relations and acculturation takes place. On the right-hand side, we have the psychological phenomena, which we can study by sampling individuals who are in these situations. And the psychological ones are essentially behavioral changes. How do people change their identities, their language, their food habits, their dress, their social relationships? We can also look at whether the challenges lead to stress and interfere with their daily lives. And we also have these acculturation strategies that I mentioned a moment ago. The question is, how do we relate to each other? How do we acculturate? On the right-hand side, we have some of the longer terms adaptations. We have psychological adaptations, which are often referred to as feeling well by Colleen Ward. A sociocultural adaptation, that is to say, doing well, being able to live successfully. And then intercultural adaptation, that is relating well, that is low levels of prejudice, high levels of tolerance. So in any study of intercultural relations or acculturation, I think this framework can provide a kind of map of what we need to study. We need to study the original cultural characteristics, the nature of their contact, what happens to them as cultural groups, and then we need, as psychologists, to study individuals for these three phenomena and these three forms of adaptation. So people living in culturally diverse societies develop views about different ways to live with each other. So a framework to identify these various ways proposes that non-dominant peoples develop strategies that guide them in how to relate to and how to adapt to their intercultural contacts. And parallel views are held by the dominant society about how ethnocultural groups should relate to each other. And these are termed expectations, and they're often enacted in public policies by the dominant group. So these strategies, which were developed in the 1970s, are based upon two elements, two issues that we should recognize now as being the two major components of multicultural policy. So the first issue is, to what extent do individuals and groups value the maintenance of their heritage cultures and identities in order to sustain their cultural communities over generations? And this is the cultural component of the multiculturalism policy from the previous diagram. And the second issue is, to what extent do individuals and groups value their contacts with and participation along with other groups in the daily life of the larger society? And this, of course, represents the social component of the multiculturalism policy. So when we allow these preferences on these two issues to intersect, we end up with a framework which is the strategies framework that some of you may have seen before. So across the top, we see this first issue, and that is the desirability to maintain our heritage cultures and identities. And down the left-hand side, the second issue of social relationships being sought amongst the various groups. And we have preferences, positive through to negative, for both of these issues. And we can study them in the ethnocultural groups, the non-dominant communities, and in the larger society themselves. And when we do this, we create an intercultural or acculturation space in a circle here, in which we can identify these different strategies. So when people don't value their heritage, culture, and identity, but want to become fully participating on a regular basis, value social relationships, we get this assimilation strategy. Negative with respect to cultural continuity, positive with involvement with the larger society. The opposite is when people value very strongly their heritage, culture, and identity, but want to achieve that by having as little to do as possible with others in the dominant group. And this gives us the separation strategy. When people don't value their heritage culture and don't participate, we end up with this situation classically known as marginalization. And when people have a double positive orientation to these two issues, valuing their heritage, culture, and identity, and wanting to socially participate on a regular basis, we have what I've been calling the integration strategy. When we look at the views of the dominant group in the larger society, when the issue is that people should give up their heritage cultures and become fully regular participants in the larger society, we end up with this way of viewing intercultural relations and expectations about acculturation, which has classically become known as the melting pot. The opposite and the corresponding view to separation is that of segregation. People could or should maintain their cultural heritage, but should have little involvement with the larger society, and we get the classical segregation. Marginalization, when it's being held as a prominent value or policy in the larger society, is exclusion. People should not keep their cultural distinctiveness, and in any case, they should not participate. They should be excluded from the larger society. And when the double positive orientation is promoted in a society, we get the multiculturalism policy and orientation. It's good for people to maintain their heritage, cultures, and identities, and it's good for people to maintain daily relationships with others in the larger society. So these terms have come to be in fairly common usage, and I just in the next slides define them in very simple terms: assimilation, separation, marginalization, and integration in the way that I've just described them. And when we look at the expectations of the people in the larger society, including policies, we get these parallel terms: melting pot, segregation, exclusion, and multiculturalism. So I want to emphasize that the terms integration and multiculturalism have very specific meanings within this framework. They're clearly different from assimilation and melting pot because they involve substantial cultural maintenance, a preference for maintaining your cultures and identities. And they're clearly different from separation and segregation because they involve substantial contact and participation in the life of the larger society. And they're clearly different from marginalization and exclusion because they promote the opposites, both cultural maintenance and social participation into an inclusive, larger society. So the three hypotheses that I mentioned before can be investigated using the various frameworks and concepts that I've just presented. They have been investigated in Canada substantially and in many other parts of the world. If they are supported, then they may move from being hypotheses to being principles of acculturation and intercultural relations. And if they're widely supported in many societies, they may also qualify as universal principles that may form the basis for answering the question being posed in this presentation of how shall we all live together. So now I'm going to move from these conceptual frameworks to some reports of empirical research. The first project I want to mention is something called the Mutual Intercultural Relations in Plural Societies, MIRAPS. All three of these hypotheses have been evaluated in an international project carried out in 20 societies of different historical, cultural, and political features. And the question is, are these hypotheses supported or are they not? And you can find these publications, the book, Mutual Intercultural Relations, which brings together 20 chapters, one from each of the countries, and also a meta-analysis that was published just last year in the journal Applied Psychology, and you can see the reference there. So the countries in the study are listed there. I won't read them out, but you can see they are highly variable, although they don't represent South America and large areas of Africa and Asia. They varied. They included migrants, refugees, national minorities, ethnocultural groups, sojourners, which are temporary workers, and international students. In some studies, not all the hypotheses were evaluated, but in 17 of the societies where we do have evaluations of these three hypotheses, there were 111 tests. And of these 111, 50 were the evaluations of their validity in the national samples, that is to say, the dominant group, and 61 were in the ethnic or ethnocultural samples. So in the evaluations, there were 37 possible evaluations of each of the three hypotheses. And the overall findings are that these three hypotheses are supported much more often than not. The integration hypothesis was supported in 86, the multiculturalism hypothesis in 92, and the contact hypothesis supported in 85% of the cases. And of particular importance is there are very few cases of non-support and only 2 negative findings. That is to say, where the findings went against the hypotheses. So here you'll see a table in which you have the three hypotheses down the left side, and you have the national or dominant group samples and the ethnic samples separated, and then the total evaluations on the right-hand side. And you can see, as I said before, from the previous slide, around 80% of the evaluations provided support of either through correlation or t-test differences at the 0.5 level or better. So we also did a meta-analysis by bringing all these 17, actually 20 now, country studies together. And what we found was that we have modest support with the meta-analysis with effect sizes which are around the 0.16 mark, which is common in all pre-registered psychological research that we have found to date. Our effect sizes were 18, 12, and 15 for the three hypotheses. So from this, both the t-tests, the 0.5 level, and from these meta-analyses, we conclude that there is support for the three hypotheses, and it's possible that we can claim them as being universal principles of acculturation and intercultural relations. So from this meta-analysis, we think we have further support, but I want to make it clear that the term universal does not mean that it's invariant across cultures or one size fits all. What it means is that the underlying processes are probably shared psychological attributes in all human populations, even though these attributes are developed and manifested in variable ways under different cultural conditions. So universal isn't one size fits all. There is obviously variability in the expression of the underlying principles. The second study that I want to share with you is one that you also may have come across. It's a bit older. It's called the International Comparative Study of Ethnocultural Youth, or ICSE is the acronym. And in 2006, there was a book and also a paper, but there have been subsequent analyses, further aspects of this database, some of them currently under review. So what we did was we used variables that assess these acculturation strategies using their cultural identities and intercultural behaviors such as language, knowledge, use, and peer relationships with their own and group and with the larger society. So we used a cluster analysis technique to derive these different profiles. So an integration profile in which national and ethnic orientations came together. Over a third of the youth were in this cluster. Assimilation, only 19%, actually the smallest of the youth. And then separation and marginalization, just under a quarter each. What is surprising is that contrary to what most people expected, youth, international, and ethnocultural youth are not trying to assimilate by giving up their cultures. They were the least dominant or least predominant cluster. The scores on psychological and sociocultural adaptation were also compared across the 4 strategy clusters. So we're now speaking to the integration hypothesis specifically. Those in the integration cluster had higher than average adaptation. Those in the marginalization or diffuse cluster had much lower levels of sociocultural and psychological adaptation. And those in the separation and ethnic cluster had higher psychological but lower sociocultural adaptation. And those in the assimilation cluster had moderately low scores on both adaptations. So here is a graph from that paper, which shows the 0 line is the total or average score of all the youth on psychological and sociocultural adaptation. And those in the integration cluster had higher than average on both. Those in the marginalization cluster had lower than average on both. Those in the ethnic cluster had higher psychological but somewhat lower sociocultural adaptation. And those in the national or assimilationist cluster had slightly lower on both. So you can see the major contrast is between those in the integration and the diffuse or marginalization cluster, with some variable results for the ethnic and national cluster members. So we assessed the level of discrimination which they had experienced, and discrimination was lowest for those in the integration and assimilation clusters, but were highest for those in the separation and marginalization clusters. This suggests what we call reciprocity in mutual intercultural relations and acculturation. That is, if you discriminate against me, I will reject you. So with discrimination, you get higher levels of separation and marginalization preferences. And then in a subsequent structural model, which I'm not showing now, discrimination was the highest and most important single variable in suppressing both psychological and sociocultural adaptation. So discrimination is perhaps the largest single psychological experience that we can identify in much of this literature. So we conclude from the second study, the ICSI study, that the integration strategy is the most favorable way for youth to acculturate and to engage in intercultural relations in these many plural societies. And further analyses of these data using different methods and controlling for other variables generally confirm this conclusion. Given that this study was carried out in a number of societies, we may claim also, again, some degree of generality or universality for this conclusion. I just want to briefly mention some research in Canada because it is part of my attempt to understand our own communities from an Indigenous perspective. Early 70s, we carried out a major national study using a survey technique sponsored by the federal ministry responsible for implementing the multiculturalism policy. And we carried out further studies in subsequent years looking at Indigenous people, immigrant, refugee, and ethnocultural groups. The most recent research has been carried out with a colleague, Feng Hu from Statistics Canada, using the most recent social survey data with many thousands of participants. And we again looked at the research. I'll just go quickly through some of this. We looked at some of the same issues. And there are 2 publications noticed there with Hu, Immigrant Acculturation and Wellbeing in Canada in the journal Canadian Psychology, and one in the International Journal of Intercultural Relations, the first one dealing with first generation, the second one dealing with second and subsequent generations. So samples of immigrants to Canada and Canadian-born individuals with at least one immigrant parent were considered to be first and second generation immigrants. We had over 8,000 participants divided between these two generations, and the net number was divided in that way. We're not advancing the slides very well here. So what we did was to create the acculturation orientations, acculturation strategy groups through what we call the lens of sense of belonging. We asked the question, how would you describe your sense of belonging to Canada? And a second question, how would you describe your sense of belonging to, in first generation, the country of origin, and in later generations, to your ethnic group? We found a very high percentage of strong sense of belonging in response to both questions, and they were moderately correlated at +1, 3, not strong enough to consider them to be non-independent. So we use two measures of well-being, the most common ones, life satisfaction, all things considered. How satisfied are you with your life as a whole? And they range from 1 to 10. And positive mental health, in general, how would you say your mental health is, from very good, good, fair, or poor? For life satisfaction in both generations, the first and second generations, we found a general pattern which supports the integration hypothesis. Those with strong belonging to both the national and the heritage groups, they had the highest scores. Those belonging or having a low sense of belonging to both groups have the lowest scores, the marginalized people. And the same pattern for life satisfaction and for mental health, supporting the integration hypothesis. The question usually arises in immigration studies about a difference between the well-being of the first generation, those who are actual immigrants, and those who have been settled for longer generations. We found that for life satisfaction, there are significant differences across the first generation and second and subsequent generations, but only the difference was between the first and second. We concluded that the first generation of immigrants have higher life satisfaction and better mental health than those in the second generation. So in addition to the acculturation strategy, that is to say integration promotes better life satisfaction and mental health, the length of residence also matters. And that is, there is a decline in life satisfaction and well-being over generations, which again raises the question, which is often posed, do immigrants come because they have poor life satisfaction or mental health? And the answer is no, they have better scores on both in the first or immigrant generation. So just to wind up, what are the implications from these conceptual frameworks and empirical findings? Can we suggest a path forward to achieve greater well-being and positive intercultural relations for both immigrants and members of the larger society? I think we can say that integration is not only possible for involvement in both your own cultural community and the larger society, but it's the most frequent. In most studies, the double preference, the double involvement, is the most common and most preferred way of engaging in acculturation and intercultural relations. There appears to be no contradiction and no need to choose between different cultural identities and practices or behaviors. So it is not only the most preferred, it is associated with the most desirable outcomes greater personal well-being, and positive social and intercultural adaptation. However, integration is only possible when societies allow it. That is to say, when members of the larger society accept that these two issues of cultural maintenance or diversity and participation are available to everyone in the larger society. That is what some of us call the multicultural vision, is promoted and accepted in the larger society. Then these empirical findings may be most likely to be valid. So integration is a personal and group strategy, and multiculturalism is a public strategy, and they have been shown to have maximal benefits. Assimilation has only few benefits, and marginalization has no benefits. In some cases, the separation strategy has provided social support, but this has been particularly true in the case of indigenous communities, not so much the case in immigrant communities. So given the advantages of the integration strategy and of the multicultural approach to organizing group relations shown in these studies, is it possible to emulate the transition that Canada went through from assimilation to multiculturalism in other culturally diverse societies? The lesson here is that change in intercultural policy is possible. If this has been the case in some societies, why not others? What conditions may be required in other societies in order to move toward this pluralist vision? And I'm raising this question, of course, for those of you in Mexico to decide how you are going to proceed to deal with the cultural diversity and the tensions that you are experiencing. One possible answer is that the kind of evidence provided by these studies may be useful to persuade you to move away from assimilationist policies or exclusion policies that are designed to achieve a culturally homogeneous society, or move towards policies that allow for integration and multiculturalism. So what can we say about these advantages? Applications can be made from these conclusions to health, to education, to justice, and to labor using these findings. What do we need to do? We need to provide a culturally and economically and personally secure place for all individuals and groups to be confident in their place in a multicultural society. We need to support the social interaction and contact and engagement of diverse individuals within the society. And what I have tried to emphasize in this presentation, advocate for the development of multiple and integrated identities rather than one single national identity or one single ethnic identity in order to live together in these culturally diverse societies. In our view, policies that are evidence-based, such as the evidence that we've provided here, they're more likely to be successful than those that are based on preconceptions or political expediency, such as those based on fear or prejudice. However, evidence alone, such as provided in these projects, is unlikely to shift public policy towards more pluralist views of ways to live together. Other factors are also important, particularly public opinion, political leadership, and the availability of resources. And public education about the benefits of multiculturalism, articulating the claim that life for everyone is enriched personally, culturally, and economically in multicultural societies should be widely shared in your public discourse. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Merci. If you have any questions, and if there's time, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Thanks. Are there any questions?
Muchas gracias, Dr. Berry. Muchas gracias por su conferencia tan completa, tan enriquecedora. Nos comparte información no solo teórica, sino también datos empíricos y lo que en particular me gusta mucho es que nos comparte esta experiencia de cómo se movieron no solo a combinar datos empíricos, ¿no?, de las investigaciones, sino esta línea que nos indica para poder incidir en políticas públicas, ¿no?, hacer que esto funcione, ¿no?, en nuestros países. Y ahora vamos a pasar a dinámica, a ver si hay algunas preguntas. La primera pregunta es, what would you rather, what would you prefer, Dr. Berry? Do you want me to translate the question, or you can read it in Spanish and try to answer whatever you choose? I hear you.
Well, an English translation would be helpful, but let me see if I can understand this one. You're talking about internal migration within a society and whether the same principles probably would apply. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, we've done some studies of internal migration in China. And the same principles apply when we use the concept of place identity. That's from environmental psychology. People have a sense of belonging to their original village and a sense of commitment to maintaining relationships with their families and friends in that original village. So, as you know, migrant workers are a very, very large number of people in China. And one study or two studies now show that when people maintain their heritage connections to their home village and also get involved in the larger city in which they have come to work, they have better levels of psychological well-being, at least, than those who forget about their home village and get involved only in the new city, or who don't get involved in their new city life, but just pine for their home village, or essentially are marginalized by being lost between the two cultures. So yes, I think that the same principles could be investigated and should be investigated.
Okay.
But in Mexico, I think that you probably are confounding regional with cultural differences,
Yes.
Which wasn't the case in China, because the people moving were from the same culture. So if you have indigenous peoples or people of mixed ancestry being the main internal migrants, then you would have to ask the double question about place identity and about cultural heritage, cultural identity, indigenous identity as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Berry. Y ya tenemos otra pregunta. Ahora sí, le hicieron en inglés. Muy bien, muchas gracias. Y antes de leerla, les pido que nos puedan compartir más preguntas para quienes no se han animado. Ahora sí, bueno, ahí la tenemos en pantalla.
Yeah, well, certainly the increase in migration flow between countries is due to globalization, which is primarily an economic phenomenon. But there are many reasons for people to move, including being refugees, being international students, and so on. And at the same time, over recent years, there is some evidence that hostility towards newcomers has increased. Some societies feel threatened, and this speaks to the multiculturalism hypothesis. When both the receiving society feels threatened by migrants or refugees, or even advocacy for rights by indigenous peoples, then their attitudes will be more negative. That's the multiculturalism hypothesis. Sense of threat, a lack of security, a lack of confidence in your own place will lead to hostility. This has become known in some circles as replacement theory. Old white men are feeling that they're being replaced by others. I think that the only solution here is to encourage the people who have a dominant position in society to understand that change has always taken place. So, for example, as of yesterday, the 2021 census in Canada announced that 26% of all people living in Canada were not born here. And our national policy is to actually increase the number of migrants in the annual flow. You can see on international surveys, such as Pew and Gallup, that some countries, in response to the question, is immigration level about right, too high, or too low? Canada is the only country in the world where about right and too low, more than too high. Most countries, and increasingly so, are viewing that immigration flows are too high. The question is how to advocate for the acceptance of increased diversity by showing that it enhances the cultural, social, and economic qualities of a society. And there's lots of evidence that this is true. But of course, politicians make this issue one of fear and a sense of threat for their own electoral purposes. It needs to be countered by psychological evidence that diversity is a public good and is a personal good for everyone. Having multiple identities, multiple peoples interacting makes individuals and societies a better place to live. Public education, based upon this kind of evidence, is one of the responsibilities of all of us as researchers and as citizens.
Thank you very much. And it's great, very interesting, the question and the answer. Give us many lines to keep working, to keep studying the phenomena, particularly in Mexico. We have this internal migration phenomena. As I think it's equal, not the same, but it's something natural for many countries, for many societies. In the case of Yucatan, we are living a similar situation with internal migration, and I think we have a lot of work to do in that way. Hay una pregunta más, si nos la pueden compartir, gracias.
So other policies, well, I have a recent paper with a colleague, Dmitry Grigoriev, on it's a taxonomy of intercultural policies. And what we find is that it's easy to distinguish multiculturalism policy from segregation and assimilation, but it's less easy to distinguish the outcomes. It's easy to say that multiculturalism leads to greater benefits than assimilation or exclusion or segregation. But it's less easy to say whether multiculturalism policies have superior outcomes, say, to color blindness. That is to say, promoting that we are all one people, there are no differences, and we should stop talking about these differences. Or interculturalism, which gives priority to the dominant group, which is now being tried out in the province of Quebec, in preference to multiculturalism, which gives equal status to every cultural group. There is no official culture. Indeed, our current Prime Minister has said that we don't even have a mainstream in the country, in Canada as a whole, and that no group takes priority over any other group. So the alternative policies have not really been evaluated as much as the integration or multiculturalism hypothesis. So I don't know whether any of these alternatives can be recommended. I mean, I know Spanish language and Spanish origin culture takes predominance in Mexico, just as for a long time British culture and English language took precedence in Canada and continues in some regions. The question is, can other languages and other cultures come to the fore with equal status so that everyone feels as if their cultural group has a place in society? And when they, going back to the question of internal migration, when they move, say, from a Mayan community in the Yucatan to a larger city elsewhere, can they find that they are accepted as people speaking another language with different and having a different identity and different cultural practices? Suppressing them, threatening them, we know leads to poor relationships and poor personal outcomes. Segregating them, pushing them into barrios or other excluded communities leads to criminality and violence through the marginalization of these communities and people. So the acceptance and social interaction programs for maintenance and social participation, as in the multiculturalism policy, seems to me the only way forward, based on the evidence and based on my, of course, obvious personal preference.
Thank you very much. And I find it very interesting in the way you have just mentioned something that I find it very specific, very important in our context. And this, we have a challenge, specific challenge. When it comes to internal migration, we all speak Spanish, but the intonation, the way we speak the Spanish and the use of certain words for regions, it's different, and we are like making obvious the difference between people just because the way we speak. And this is funny because it makes the migrants feel like differentiated, and maybe in that way they don't feel they have a place here. Yeah? And it is been having an impact psychologically talking. It's very interesting. And thank
Well,
you.
this is the paradox.
Mhm.
Being culturally who you are, and hence being culturally different in another setting, is what supports you as a human being. It only becomes an impediment, a challenge, when the people that you're dealing with who are different from yourself treat you negatively on the basis of those differences. So this raises the issue of the role of discrimination and negative attitudes as being the single most important negative factor in the well-being of individuals and the well-being of their community. We in Canada, and I think in many countries, have laws against hate speech, have laws against discrimination, have laws against exclusion in employment and housing, based upon a long list of qualities, whether it's language or culture or identity, sexual orientation. And these laws go a long way, but they need to be enforced, and recourse needs to be provided through the justice system for people who are discriminated against on the basis of cultural or related qualities. So we know the evidence is very clear. Discrimination causes hardship, psychological hardship, and reduces well-being. So that is a cost to individuals, but it's also a cost to society.
Yes, yes, of course. Ok, tenemos preguntas, no sé si pueden pasar la siguiente. Ok, aquí está, muchas gracias.
The research in this area has, of course, evolved from the time of the 1970s when I first promoted some of these concepts. Like most research areas, the concepts have become differentiated, they become more complex. So one of the most important advances, in my view, was made by Marisol Navas in Spain, when she made much more clear that there are different domains, whether it's food, work, identity, social relationships, in the acculturation and intercultural process. And that by having one scale that includes all of these different domains, your preferences for maintenance and for social interaction, you obscure the importance of these different domains. So she has a differentiated way of assessing these preferences. Another important distinction was made between public and private preferences. Do you want to assimilate in public but segregate or separate in your private life, in your family or your community? So these issues have made the whole area of research more differentiated, more complex, and I think that this is likely to continue. One area that I think is particularly important is to understand the overall national context. I've argued previously, and I did today, that integration as a strategy is most likely to be successful when it is possible for you to be accepted as culturally different. If you're constantly being beaten up because you speak a different language, then the integration strategy is not likely to be as successful as in a society where it's possible to speak another language and to be accepted on that basis. So the national context is important. Two of my colleagues here at Queen's University have something called the Multiculturalism Policy Index, the MCI, in which they rate the ways in which people who are culturally different, whether they're immigrants, national minorities, or indigenous people. They have 3 different versions of this index. And you can look up where Mexico is. I can't remember offhand where you are, but any attempt to improve your position on that index with respect to education, healthcare, justice, employment, and so on, would improve the possibility that the multiculturalism or integration way of trying to live together would be more successful than if people are moving against the acceptance of diversity and social relations.
Yeah, very interesting. Dr. Berry, we had a lot of questions, and which is great. I think is great, but we don't have time enough. We will have just to pass one more, and I'll come after I go share the other questions with you if you let us. But we can close with this last one.
I think some countries have tried, this would be an issue of quota. I think quotas are threatening to And so it would go against the multiculturalism hypothesis. What we have in Canada is something called employment equity. And that is that a workforce should reflect as much as possible the people that that company or agency serves. And that this would apply to universities in particular. Over 30 years ago, I headed a commission at my university here, which argued that any public institution should reflect in its workforce the population it serves, and that's true for the people who work there or the students who come there. In our federal legislation, we have to do stock taking every few years, and if we are not moving towards the profile of the people in the comparison group, then you could lose funding from federal sources, including research grants. So there are incentives to move towards a more equitable workforce, but no quotas. And I think that's probably the correct way to go. But what happens in most countries, I am not sure. In Mexico, you can tell me whether you have a requirement that all new faculty hires have to take into account the cultural backgrounds of the people who apply in order for your professoriate to be role models for the students that are coming into your universities.
We have very poor policies in that way, but I think it's the important thing here is just what you have just said about it's just not the best way to improve or to encourage the multicultural the integration. I think the best way to do it must be like you just said, the equality in opportunities. In certain companies or organization, we don't, specifically in Yucatan, we don't look at that way, but it is being considered like one of the domains in which Yucatecans feel threatened because migrants are like stealing our jobs in certain ways, but it is more something related to capabilities to make more plural, diverse, the laboral force in many ways. And I think that it's one of the way we have to work with our society. They are not stealing, they are making richer our society. We are more plural than we have ever thought before. And that there are a lot of challenges over there.
Let me just add one comment to the question about the future of acculturation research. Gail Ferguson, who is originally from Jamaica, has worked on the issue of remote acculturation.
Mm-hmm.
Or others, such as Tracy Burno in New Zealand, have worked on acculturation through tourism. So particularly on the coast, you have hundreds of thousands of tourists from many parts of the world. What is the impact on acculturation and relationships between, as a result of this massive tourist influx and the bringing of cultural and language and other ways of living on the local population? That would be one area for acculturation and intercultural research to move in the Yucatan.
Thank you. Very interesting. A lot of work to do, a lot of research, and certainly that's we have historically have more influence from other countries than even from our Mexico. We, in particular Yucatan, we have been isolated from the rest of the República, from the rest of the country, and historically we had been like distinguished or differentiated of the rest of the country by this cultural influences. But certainly we haven't studied what is happening right now, no, with this tourism, with these encounters, and even when it comes to the younger people who are interacting more them in remote way with other cultures, with TV series and all these things we can find it in the way of these other ways of acculturation, not just the face-to-face encounter, but certainly a lot of work to do. We are very thankful for your participation, for your conference, for all you have just shared with us. We appreciate a lot, and we hope to keep in touch with you. And I would like to close this conference with con un reconocimiento. Le queremos dar un reconocimiento al doctor John Berry por su participación. I'm going to read in Spanish. La Facultad de Psicología otorgan la presente constancia al doctor John Berry por impartir la conferencia How Shall We All Live Together en el marco de la Cátedra Rogelio Díaz-Guerrero en su edición 2022. Luz, Ciencia y Verdad, firma el maestro Jesús Esteban Sochachan, Media Yucatán, a 26 de octubre del 2022. Muchísimas gracias, doctor John Berry, por sus contribuciones.
Thank you very much for this chance to share my ideas with you, and I hope that you have enjoyed them and possibly even inspired to continue work in this area in your own culturally rich part of the world.
For sure. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos y a todas que nos acompañaron. Tengan un excelente día y les invitamos a acompañarnos en los siguientes eventos. Muchas gracias, Dr. John Berry.
Bye-bye.
Bye.